Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of our RUSI conference on global perspectives on the transnational far-right threat and response. My name is Claudia Wallner, and I'm a research analyst in the Terrorism Conflict Research Group here at RUSI. Following on from the first session on which gave a global overview of the expressions of far-right extremism in different regions. This session will focus on transnational online connections between individuals and communities that are associated with the far-right or on the far-right spectrum. We'll be looking at connections via mainstream and non-mainstream social media, messaging apps, as well as through online gaming. And we'll also be discussing the role of transnational online communities and the transnationalization of conspiracy theories in online communities, as well as the potential strategies that can be used to prevent and to counter the spread of such ideologies and conspiracy theories online. Now, just a few brief housekeeping notes before we start a session to keep everything running smoothly. So after our four speakers have given their initial remarks, we'll be hopefully having some time for questions and answers. So please use the Q&A function on the conference platform to post your questions. And also just to note, our first speaker will unfortunately have to leave us before the Q&A. So if you have any questions specifically for him, feel free to get in touch with him using the networking function on the conference platform. And also I've noticed that some people had some issues with joining the conference platform. They joined us on Zoom instead. So please, I'll ask our events team to please share the link to the conference platform again, because it has a lot more functionalities that can be used. And lastly, also just a warning that during the presentation, some images may be shown that may that some of you may find objectionable. Obviously, RUSI and also our speakers don't support the content of those images, but they're only included wherever they are necessary to clarify an argument or underline the research. So with that out of the way, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our fantastic speakers for this panel. So firstly, we have Professor Stuart Macdonald, who is a professor of law at Swansea University's Hillary Rodham Clinton School of Law, and he's also the director of the university's Cyber Threats Research Center, CYTREC. He'll be followed by Dr. Ashley Mattheis, who's currently a guest lecturer at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And she also holds fellowships with CAR, the Center of the Analysis of the Radical Right, and IRMS, the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism. Then we have Jacob Davey, who is head of research and policy at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, ISD, leading on all work addressing far-right extremism and hate online. And last but not least, we have Kate Davis, who's chief of staff and a senior researcher at Moonshot, a social enterprise working to end online harms, including violent extremism. Now, without further ado, let's start with our first speaker. Stuart, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to RUSI and to the organisers for putting on this event and for the invitation to speak today. Ashley and I are doing a joint presentation, and Ashley is looking after the slides, which hopefully you can now see on your screen. So our title is Understanding Atomwaffen and Affiliated Groups, Variations, Practices and Interconnections. And if we could go to the next slide, please. This presentation is part of a wider project that was organised by CYTREC, the Cyber Threats Research Centre at Swansea. And on the screen, you can see the 10 members of the project team. What this project did was to look at Islamic State and Atomwaffen Division activity on public-facing Telegram channels. It was a multi-stakeholder research project. And as there were quite a few of us in the research team, we divided the work up into a number of sub-projects. So Ashley and I are going to be speaking about one of the sub-projects today. Some of the other projects are actually being presented at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning as part of the AVERT symposium. So if you're interested in learning about some of the other projects, Maura Conway will be talking about usernames. Conor Rees will be talking about the file sharing platforms that IS exploits. Camille and Farangis will be comparing the narratives into contrasting Islamic State Telegram channels. And Simon Copeland will be looking at a group that we discovered in the course of this project called Trident's Division. And he'll be talking a bit about the strategies employed by Trident. But as I said, Ashley and I are going to focus on Atomwaffen Division and its affiliate groups. That's our focus for this presentation. And if we could go to the next slide, please. What I'd like to do, first of all, is to provide an overview of the data set. So we had all these different sub-projects, but what they all had in common was using the same shared data set, which was kindly provided to us by Tech Against Terrorism. So in terms of data collection, there were 3 stages to our data collection. The first was to identify potentially relevant Telegram channels, and 3 techniques we used here. First was keyword searches. The second was to monitor Atomwaffen Division on other platforms in order to find join links to relevant Telegram channels. And then thirdly, there was monitoring of known Atomwaffen Division Telegram channels in order to identify links to new ones. Once potentially relevant channels had been discovered, the second stage was then to decide whether it was indeed an Atomwaffen Division channel or a channel of an affiliated group. And then the third stage was to extract the data. And if you look at the table on the screen, you can see from the dates of the first posts and the date of the last posts, these channels did face quite significant levels of disruption. And so data were extracted on a daily basis in order to try and capture as much of the data as possible, given the levels of disruption that the group was experiencing. Even then, there were still some gaps in the data we were able to extract, and that's the reason behind some of the words unknown on the table. There were some gaps, and that meant rather than state definitively public or private in that second column, we preferred to say unknown. There are 2 key points I'd like to highlight from this table. The first is Tech Against Terrorism has a policy of non-engagement with channel administrators on Telegram or any other platform. And so because of its policy of non-engagement, the data collection was limited to public channels and to private channels with publicly available join links where no engagement with the administrator was necessary to join. And if you look at that second column, you'll see there were a couple of private channels in the data. So those were joined using a publicly available link without engaging with the channel administrator. And that's quite a stark contrast to the Islamic State half of this project, where we were only able to join public channels. And perhaps it shows a different level of security consciousness between Islamic State and Atomwaffen Division. The fact that we were able to join these private channels without engaging with the administrator perhaps shows a level of confidence or even complacency that wasn't present on the Islamic State part of the project. The other point I wanted to highlight was the third column, and that is that the majority of these channels were broadcast channels, meaning that only the administrator could post in those channels. But there were some interactive channels, some channels which allowed for user interaction. Then if we could go to the next slide, please, Ashley. This gives a further overview of the data set, and what it tries to do is to look at the channels in the study in the context of the wider online ecosystem. So first of all, it looks at outlinks, and you can see there an outlinking rate of 1.9%. In other words, only about 2% of the posts in the channels outlinked to other online spaces. And that's quite a low rate of outlinking. The comparative figure for the Islamic State side of the project was 15%. So there was a lot more outlinking there. And in a forthcoming study that I completed, looking at the outlinking practices of 2 pro-far-right European networks on Twitter, the outlinking rate was about 6.5%. So the outlinking rate on Telegram was markedly lower. So that suggests that Telegram is not being used by this group as a gateway to other platforms. The inlinking rate was also low at just 2%. And these inlinks in every case took you to other Telegram channels. And then finally, you can see a much higher attachment rate. So the number of posts containing an attachment, that was over 30%. And here there was a clear emphasis on visual content. Images were the most common type of attachment at 40%, followed by video content at 28%. So that's a quick overview of the data set, and I'm going to hand over at this point to Ashley to tell you a bit more about our findings.
Thank you, Stuart. As Stuart mentioned, I'm going to discuss our sub-project on Atomwaffen Division and its affiliates. Atomwaffen is part of what is known as Siege Culture Online, which is related to their adherence to the text Siege by James Mason as a primary text. So some of the specific groups within the wider aegis of siege culture have come under scrutiny, including prosecutions, monitoring, and terrorist designation by individual governments. Research tends to focus on the ideology and well-known instantiations of the culture. However, understanding the specifics of how they work toward building a globally networked culture is less well studied. It is starting to be more of a focus at the moment. So this project provides an initial foray into exploring these localized groups and their global interconnections, excuse me, through the communicative practices they use on the Telegram platform. Key findings from the project indicate that despite disruptions, this digitally networked culture continues to develop and establish new local organizations. These organizations rely on a visual vernacular, specific narrowly rendered aesthetics such as color palettes, fonts, and imagery to incorporate their local brand under what I have termed the meta brand of Atomwaffen, the most well-known division of the bunch. Importantly, these organizations work as a decentralized distributed networked culture, that is, as a multinodal, supranational, horizontally structured type of organization. This structure and their communicative practices online provide technical and practical benefits, specifically resilience to moderation, intervention, and disruption, as well as effecting an approximation of leaderless resistance. Through analyses of the various channel discussions and related content, we split the groups by their life stages into established or developing organizations. This determination was based on the existence of empirical research and reporting on specific divisions, as well as the division's own discussion of their recent establishment. This categorization helped and enabled us to understand better how these groups interacted on Telegram. So the established channels shown here included the highest volume of posts, widest range of content, and the most interactive channels where ideological reinforcement and adherence were promoted through chat-based discussions. These channels also incorporated the most cross-divisional engagement, as multiple users were also members of other channels. This cross-membership in interactive channels provides a framework for networking the various divisional groups and ensuring relative ideological consistency across the network. Divisions maintaining these channels include Atomwaffen Division and Feuerkrieg Division, which have both supposedly disbanded after high-profile arrests of some group leaders. The remaining leaders of Atomwaffen reformed under the group name National Socialist Order, and Feuerkrieg has reformed under the name International White Syndicate. However, these channels still utilize their original brands, indicating the importance of brands within this culture. Alternately, the organizations shown here were identified as developing divisions. These channels stress growth, including sharing recruitment applications and requesting submission of images and videos of members posting flyers, which is a common early stage practice for building a sense of presence and division identity. The channels run by developing divisions include Atomwaffen Argentina, Totenwaffen, Kriegwaffen, Volknut, and Cult 88. These have more modest volume of posts and fewer members. They are also primarily set up as broadcast channels and thus have a narrower range of content limited to branded and curated material that moderators share, which is typically focused on building and reinforcing divisional identity and cohesion. Several of the channels shared a focus on building solidarity within the larger movement, regularly sharing Telegram join links to affiliates. Here, the 7 groups in the dataset mention or share join links and content from an additional 11, primarily siege culture channels, indicating a wider network of groups globally. Preliminary searches of those groups' available Telegram statistics again show a much broader network of far-right extremist interconnections, in some cases across ideological lines, and possible distant connections to QAnon channels. For the division channels shared in the dataset, sharing an array of channels, join links, and content helps build wider and more deeply interconnected networks of relationships. Importantly, these mentioned organizations are also accessible for interaction via Telegram. As such, these inclusions highlight the ways network digital cultures promote users' participation with and connections between members of different ideological organizations. Here, the selection by channel moderators of specific groups' join links and content to share works to curate appropriate ideological affiliations for their members. The usage of interactive and broadcast channels within the dataset highlights the importance of ideology, identity, and group cohesion within and across siege cultural groups and online contexts. The necessity of regular reinforcement of members' identification with siege cultural norms at both the ideological and individual levels is rooted in the need to develop coherence across multiple divisions and unaffiliated actors making up the transnational network. The interactive chat channels function as sites of peer-to-peer ideological reinforcement, where discussions include various types of ideology reinforcing narratives, such as what members are planning to do after society collapses, what constitutes proper adherence to siege ideology, the disparagement of other far-right extremist groups, and concerns over disruption and infiltration of groups by federal agents. Some discussions occur entirely through images, often memes and videos with no written commentary in the entire thread conversation. This visual mode of communication is especially important in interactive channels, which include memberships across a variety of countries and incorporating at least 7 languages, including English, German, Spanish, Dutch, Ukrainian, Russian, and Czech. Moreover, drawing on the communicative styles from other social media platforms like Reddit and the Chans, similarly provides a common set of cross-cultural communicative norms. The broadcast channels are used to announce division news and share media focusing on promoting division-specific identity reinforcement, both internally and with other affiliated divisions. Images shared by moderators are focused on specific aesthetic genres, including division flyers and topical posters as seen here. Here, the colors, symbols, fonts, and topical inclusions can be replicated with slight tweaks by individual divisions, which also works to create a unified brand aesthetic across divisions transnationally. This indicates that the broadcast channels are used to provide printable and shareable branded materials for group members used in the common offline practice of flyering local communities with posters that include contact information and recruiting messages such as join your local Nazis or race war now, promoting that specific location's division. In one case, a division poster was developed to show 4 steps of terrorist awakening, listing reading material for each step and then providing a link for file sharing sites where the text could be downloaded. The 2 primary methods these divisions channels use to promote transnational interconnections and broad siege cultural identity formation is to announce alliances with other groups and to cross-post their join links and materials. Among the divisions in the dataset, there are several such announcements, including alliances between Atomwaffen Division Argentina and Totenwaffen, Feuerkrieg and Inject Division, Kriegwaffen and Iron Order, as well as a larger alliance between Feuerkrieg, Atomwaffen Division Argentina, and Inject Division. Alliances are integral to the maintenance of these groups as a transnational network because they express shared interests and support between divisions, enable established divisions to give a public stamp of approval to developing divisions, and technologically speaking, enable resilience and redundancy to content moderation and bans. Furthermore, alliances highlight the growth of the overall movement to members and non-members alike, which is particularly important in light of the disruptions and pressure. Thus, projecting strength in numbers is a major component of this type of propaganda. Alliances also provide strong cross-posting between allied organizations, including both content and join links. Here is an example of content that expresses this strategic communicative practice. In this video, we see multiple division badges projected in succession as a symbolic notice of alignment or alliance and solidarity. This followed by the text, "What matters is not identity, but our message," and includes a call to action and autonomy, a call to unity, and a claim that they are organized. The footage in the background is from a hate camp, which is another typical practice drawn from the original propaganda of Atomwaffen Division, positioning it as something the division should recognize and either share as an experience or as an aspiration for new members. Along with this type of messaging, cross-posting material and encouraging channel members to join multiple channels provides redundancy against content or channel removal, and multi-member channels provide resiliency when channels are removed, as new channel links can be posted in allied channels, enabling users to quickly return to populate the recreated channel's membership. Just this week, a new alliance was announced, including a group of divisions not captured in our data set. Interestingly, these divisions have named their alliance the United Acceleration Front. Here, the inclusion of 5 groups and the assignment of an official name indicates a move toward potentially developing alliances into a more expansive network. This development highlights the importance of our findings regarding the technical and practical benefits for these groups' use of alliances and cross-posting, especially in attempting to generate resiliency across their loosely affiliated network and affecting an approximation of leaderless resistance, which is intended to lessen the impacts of institutional, particularly legal interventions by design. In closing, what the dataset makes clear is that despite pressure from governments on some established groups, the transnational siege cultural network remains active with regular engagement between multiple local divisions in a variety of geographies. This indicates that policy, prevention, technical, and legal frames for addressing siege culture groups, their digital presence, and their potential to mobilize to violence must adapt to address their distributed, decentralized, and digitally networked structure by developing similarly networked solutions approaches that can effectively address multinodal, supranational, organizational affiliations.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I'll hand it over to Jacob.
Thank you, and thanks so much for RUSI for organising this great event, and also to Ashley and Stuart just now. That was fascinating. Look forward to your analysis, Kate, as well, but can't say that afterwards. I'm just going to pull up some slides very quickly. So can I just get a nod from you, Claudia, that you can see these slides? Great, fantastic. So broadly speaking, what I'm just going to talk through is what we've just heard, a sort of really deep case study and deep dive into one part of this transnational dynamic, and particularly that sort of accelerationist siege culture community. I'm going to talk more broadly to some of the key trends and some of the key dynamics which we've been seeing through our analysis, and sort of describe what transnationalization, what international outlook looks like for a number of different data points. And broadly speaking, on the approach to analysis at ISD, we're, of course, as I'm sure everyone here is, deeply aware that extremists and the extreme right wing don't operate on just 1 or 2 platforms. They have this vast universe of media platforms, of social media sites, which they operate on. This is constantly shifting and constantly in flux. So at ISD, our approach is to really try and capture as much of this universe as possible through our data analysis, both through what we call a digital ethnographic approach, so embedding analysts in communities where data access is less accessible through platform APIs, but then also through a big data approach as well, where we gather as much data as we can and interrogate it across platforms. Through this work, we've built a wide-ranging global repository of information which relates to right-wing extremist activity across the English-speaking world, but also in Europe. And this data set contains more than 25 million messages sent by over 20,000 accounts, and that's just the data we've got since 2019. Now, through the analysis and through our digital analysis system, there are a number of key trends which relate more broadly to extreme right-wing activity, which I just want to pause on for a second before we go into the sort of nitty-gritty of what the international dynamics look like. So I think really, over the past decade, we've seen the wholesale transformation of the extreme right-wing ecosystem and threat. And I see this very much as intrinsically linked to online activity and intrinsically linked to what's going on social media. So whereas before we might have seen sort of primarily quite localized, nationally oriented groups, we've seen the transformation of this into very much large-scale tech-savvy movements, both with an international reach, but who are also able to translate their online mobilization into quite effective offline action. And so through our analysis across those country contexts, a number of key trends jump out time and time again. Firstly, that when you look at these communities and look at these groups, they're hugely successful at connecting dots across a broad spectrum. So whilst you might have neo-Nazis on Telegram, what we're seeing is the borrowing of ideas and the borrowing of tactics by other communities and other groups. And this itself spreads on beyond, I think, the actual bounds of what we might traditionally associate with the extreme right as well. So conspiracy theorist communities who aren't necessarily ideologically aligned are again networking online, learning from tactics and engaging in the sort of diffusion and transfer of ideas. I think importantly, again, mobilization and the threat of violence comes from across this broad ideological spectrum as well, rather than just one or two violent groups. So at IST, we very much like to look at this from a network-based approach and look at that spectrum in its entirety. The result of the shift in this landscape has been, I think, on the one hand, an increasingly empowered and violent set of extreme right-wing activists and hate groups. The Global Terrorism Index pointed to a 250% increase in white supremacist-driven terror attacks in the 5 years leading up to 2020. Broadly, we've also seen the mainstreaming of extremist and conspiracy thinking. So extremist movements, I think in part aided by social media, in part aided by the support or the sort of dog whistle amplification by political figures as well, have significantly enlarged their sphere of influence. And what we see when we look at the promotion and proliferation of conspiracy networks is that this itself allows extremists access to significantly expanded audiences online. We've seen this transnational dynamic, the focus of this event, which I'm really going to be diving into, where we're seeing the effective flow of ideas, cultures, and strategies across borders between these actors, but also collaboration on specific campaigns and specific events as well. And then the emergence of this post-organizational dynamic, where mobilization to violence doesn't just come from organized groups with a hierarchical structure, but also from this loose online communities, sort of connected to those networks, which we just heard Ashley and Stuart talk about. So I pulled out a couple of research case studies. Now, the last research case study went really deep into one piece. What I'm going to be doing is just pulling out a couple of trends to show you what this sort of transnational dynamic looks like in action. So the first piece I want to look to is Twitter and the spread more broadly of great replacement and the replacement theory. So if you're not familiar, the great replacement theory essentially claims that European identities, European in inverted commas, are under threat due to increasing immigrant populations. So native Europeans, so-called, are being replaced. Now, it was first coined by the French writer Renaud Camus, over 10 years ago now, but was spread slowly, firstly through identitarian movements across Europe, so ethno-nationalist groups operating in a number of European countries, but then also globally as well. And it really came to the fore in the 2019 Christchurch attack on 2 mosques, where a white supremacist terrorist published a manifesto called The Great Replacement before going and committing the attacks. Now, at this time, we were really interested to see what the online picture looked like. What does online conversation look like? I hope this would give us an idea to the key to how this had spread from a relatively obscure idea to a sort of key trope of right-wing extremists internationally. So what we did was we searched for mentions and discussion of great replacement theory on Twitter, running from April 2012 through to April 2019. And what we find is this very sort of insipid bubbling away where the idea gradually grows and gradually spreads, more than quadrupling in size in terms of the number of people talking about it before, of course, there's a massive spike following the attack. But interestingly, when we drilled in to these points, so these sort of 2 yearly intervals, what we found was the number of people in different countries were discussing this as well. So what this really shows you is how the ideas on social media can spread from relatively obscure points to gradually spread to a global audience. Now, importantly, this is a dynamic which we see time and time again when looking at key concepts. So this volume over time graph shows similar talking points shows a similar dynamic, particularly on Facebook and Instagram when you look at QAnon activity. And again, when we drilled into the data here, we saw that although this started off in America, this gradually spread to increase global audiences, so spread across the English-speaking world, spread to Germany as well. And I think that this sort of hockey stick effect is quite important when we're considering this, because really it has implications for effective moderation on social media. Now, of course, these ideas often only get taken down by platforms like Twitter and Facebook after the hockey stick has occurred, after that mass spread, that mass boom to an increased and expansive audience. But really the implication here is that if you cut further down and further off, as analysts are first starting to go, this is something you should be concerned about, then that itself might have an impact on how mainstreamed and how widespread those ideas are. Another point I want to talk to is sort of just looking at international influences and particularly the role of the USA. So the data I'm about to present comes from a study we just conducted in Canada, looking at extreme right-wing activity across Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, but also 4chan and Telegram. So we had a seed list of, I think, 6,000 accounts. And what we did was we broke down their points of discussion by theme. Now, interestingly, what we found was that these extremists in Canada were focused nearly as much on US politics, this figure 169,000, as they were on domestic politics. Now, when we conduct similar exercises time and time again in Australia, in New Zealand, this trend again points out. So what we're finding is that actually what's happening in America has an outweighted effect on the English-speaking extremist landscape. What happens, events which happen in America really serve to energize and mobilize extremists internationally. And this one really jumped out to me. What we also did was we used machine learning to break down the places, the topics, and the people which Canadian extremists were talking about. What we found is they're actually talking about extremist places and people in the US more than they are in their own country, again, pointing to this. And again, this is a trend which stands out from work we've done in New Zealand. We've got far-right extremists in New Zealand talking about their Second Amendment rights. They don't have a Second Amendment in New Zealand. So this sort of points again to another dynamic, which is really important. And I think has actual quite significant practical implications, particularly for people monitoring or seeking to mitigate this, is that you need to have an awareness around what's going on internationally when looking at a domestic extremist ecosystem, because what happens internationally will very likely inflame and exacerbate that ecosystem. I have a couple more case studies, but actually the final one's quite similar to what Ashley and Stuart presented on, so I won't do this, but I'm going to do very quickly just some analysis we did on Steam. Sort of think and consider how this international exchange isn't just happening on like big popular extremist platforms like 4chan or like Facebook or like Twitter, but also on sort of some fringe ones. So this is from a piece of work which we've done at ISD, looking at gaming. I should here give a very quick plug to the Extremism and Gaming Research Network, which we're in with RUSI. It's on the RUSI website, but we conducted some analysis across gaming platforms to look at extreme right-wing activity there. Steam is the one of the most popular PC game distribution service online. And what we found is there are these spaces essentially where gamers are allowed to connect and build clubs with their friends so they can play online. But these also play host to a really wide range and quite diverse community of right-wing extremists, running from neo-Nazis through to far-right political parties. And Steam itself is acting as a nexus to connect these communities. So we started off by looking at UK focus groups in this exercise, but by leapfrogging and looking at the groups which the members of those UK focus groups were part of, we actually saw that there's sort of this transnational network of actors operating on the Steam platform. This included the Nordic resistance movement, Generation Identity, also Misanthropic Division. So I really just point this out to say that really wherever you'll see a transnational audience coming together, even on a platform primarily designed to facilitate people coming together over a shared hobby like gaming, you will also see this transnational interplay between extremist communities. I'm not going to talk to the post-organizational dynamics, but I can if you have questions. This is some Telegram analysis, similar to what we've just heard, but looking more broadly at violent communities. I guess the top line there is that there are a wide range of communities not affiliated with groups at all, not affiliated with a name organization, which are actively promoting and actively encouraging their users to commit acts of terror. I'll finish there, but please get in touch with me on Twitter if you want to follow up or have a chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jacob. Another fascinating contribution here. Now, just a reminder, please do drop your questions in the Q&A box, because I think we'll have some time for questions and answers for this session. So please go ahead with that. But without further ado, I will hand it over to our last speaker, Kate. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here today, and thanks to RUSI for organising this session, and also to all the other speakers for their brilliant presentations so far. Just to check that you guys can see my screen, my slides. Awesome, thank you. So yeah, hi, I'm Kate Davis, Chief of Staff and Senior Researcher at Moonshot. For those of you who don't know, we're a social enterprise based in London and DC that works with governments, tech companies and NGOs to respond to violent extremism online across Europe and globally. We work to end all forms of online harm, including extremism, misogyny, human trafficking, and child abuse and exploitation. But obviously my focus today will be on the fight against right-wing extremism. So over the past 6 years, Moonshot has been working to gather data to map and to deliver messaging and interventions online with extreme right-wing actors worldwide. In this presentation, oh, sorry, let me just make sure I'm presenting. Yeah, in this presentation, I'm going to draw on these global data sets to give you a sense of some of the trends we're seeing, which will reinforce a lot of the points made by the other speakers. And then in particular, I'm going to draw out what that means for opportunities to engage with these audiences online in prevention and intervention initiatives. So you'll all be aware, and as the speakers have already other speakers have already spoken to, that there has been a rise in extreme right-wing attacks over the past years. These events cannot be viewed in isolation, but are part of a growing trend of global violence where each attack builds on the other. In this graphic, we've broken down a string of these attacks in which perpetrators indicated online that they were inspired by previous perpetrators, or they consumed and referenced one another's manifestos, and in some cases communicated directly with one another online. The last 5 attacks on this chart were carried out by individuals who indicated through their online behaviour that they were inspired by or idolised the Christchurch perpetrator. And this is only data through 2019. Since 2019, as we all know, we've been in multiple states of crisis globally. Extremist movements thrive in moments like this. They seek to turn fear and anxiety into an opportunity for them. The pandemic is, of course, one of these crises, and it also has practical implications for communication mechanisms across the US, UK, and globally. Just like many of us are dialing in today from our kitchens and spending far more time online, so are extremists. We saw notable increases in attempts to access far-right extremist content on search engines across 2020 and 2021. Just this year, in the US, we're at 140% higher engagement on search engines than pre-pandemic. Similarly, our recent research conducted into incel communities found individuals regularly spending upwards of 20 hours a day online. So it's important to note that far-right extremist groups have always been international, seeking international ties, learning from one another's tactics, and establishing legitimacy through international recognition and partnerships. However, the mainstreaming of many of these movements has accelerated this internationalization, and we've identified 3 key trends in global cooperation among far-right extremist groups. A lot of these themes have been covered by other speakers today, which reassures me that they're right, but I will talk them through them anyway, and particularly with a mind to what it means for our response. So firstly, we have seen a worrying collaboration between groups on effective communications and operational tactics. The evolution of these tactics over the last year has partly been driven by the pandemic, limiting offline action, but also by a desire to capitalize on the mainstream coverage of extreme right-wing talking points. An example of this in action with a proliferation of crowdfunding campaigns, such as campaigns shared to pay for Carl Rittenhouse's legal fees, the 17-year-old shooter in Kenosha, Portland, who shot and killed 2 BLM protesters in August 2020. These campaigns were launched and funded by global audiences, with a significant proportion of UK-based extreme right-wing actors donating and expressing their support for Rittenhouse. This global collaboration poses a unique problem when trying to craft intervention initiatives. When one group innovates, all geographies now have to react. Secondly, we have also seen extremist narratives seamlessly crossing borders. Jacob's presentation really outlined some of this cross-continental spread in relation to harmful conspiracy theories, but we've also identified this in relation to narratives relating to election fraud. So the allegations of voter fraud, which were seen during the US election, crossed the Atlantic and became a central topic of conversation among UK-based audiences during the election season last year. This had long-lasting repercussions, with the same audiences repurposing those narratives during the recent London mayoral election, claiming that votes had been rigged after Sadiq Khan's victory. But the biggest change that I've seen over the past year is the blending of several previously distinct groups, movements, and ideologies, each with different motivations, increasingly merging and joining forces. The last year has seen far-right extremists and armed groups push messaging alongside anti-vaccination conspiracy theorists, election fraud conspiracy theories, and more. A great example of this was the Save Our Children rallies held across the UK last year, where people attended demonstrating for causes as diverse as veteran rights and freedom from COVID restrictions, to those protesting against claims of satanic paedophilia amongst global elites. There truly was something for a wide range of people. This trend is particularly worrying as it brings more moderate protesters into contact with hardened conspiracy theorists and white supremacists. With generally high levels of activity across the board, this has become really dangerous and has led to the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories at a scale we've really never seen before. We're no longer dealing with a problem of niche movements, but we're dealing with the mass spread of disinformation that is then used by these movements to further their strategic objectives. The internet did not create this global movement, but it did supercharge its evolution. And it's given these groups both a significantly larger and more international audience for their exploits and violence, as well as a sense of legitimacy. It's given them a sense that they're bigger than they are. I wanted to highlight some of these findings, and particularly the metastasization of ideologies and conspiracy theories that were previously distinct through the use of a case study. So over the last 12 months, lots of my research has looked into the global incel phenomena. And for those who don't know, involuntary celibates, also known as incels, are men who define themselves by their inability to form or access romantic relationships, usually with women. A recent Moonshot investigation found a significant volume of posts on incel forums encouraging and introducing often young users to anti-Semitic and white supremacist content. A notable thread from April this year, written by a self-identified young cell or young incel seeking to understand anti-Semitism, showed the potential of these forums for radicalization, with other users responding with a high volume of anti-Semitic sentiment. One user recommended a neo-Nazi documentary, while others shared links to extreme right-wing discussion forums. In this thread, which contained about 70 comments, over 40 comments contained a slur, conspiracy theory, or the promotion of anti-Semitic material. This metastasization of ideologies, which all of our speakers have referenced today, certainly creates new challenges when it comes to interventions. Not only does it mean that events abroad are more likely to impact at home and thus increasing the need for international cooperation, it makes it challenging to respond online. Typically, we want to manage the threat by distinguishing between audiences, different responses targeted at different at-risk groups, but this is increasingly difficult when the distinction between these audiences becomes more blurred. Nonetheless, over the past several years, our efforts to directly engage with the extreme right-wing audiences globally, we've learned a few things, and I want to close out the presentation with a few examples of some of the most effective online CVE work we are delivering today to respond to right-wing extremists. So firstly, there is a space here for coordinated takedowns and disruption of their networks. As Ashley mentioned, this needs to be coordinated. We can't just take down groups one by one. But this has proven really effective on the Islamic extremist side. And we have seen the benefits of this from some high-profile takedowns of platforms and the deplatforming of several extreme right-wing influencers over the last year. This is uniquely difficult from an extreme right-wing perspective, given the scale of the threat and the historic lack of moderation of these groups. Nonetheless, we have seen this to be an effective intervention, both at minimizing the threat and the accessibility of this content. Secondly, we also run global prevention and safeguarding campaigns to inject safer content into spaces where individuals are likely to consume extreme right-wing content. This may include initiatives to signpost to local services they can access if they are suffering from the impacts of exposure to violent material online, or more curated mental health support developed with former extremists. Thirdly, we run initiatives to off-ramp extreme right-wing actors from online engagement into offline interventions programs, including setting up dedicated hotline and mental and social health intervention services. In other cases, we've partnered with specially trained gyms that work one-to-one with vulnerable individuals. There are truly a huge range of options here. It's about connecting offline prevention programs to audiences online, and we've worked with government partners globally to develop a range of programming blueprints for sustainable off-ramping into de-radicalization programs. And I'm sure we can share some of these if of interest. A general trend we've identified is that at-risk audiences are most receptive to interventions immediately after attacks. We always see engagement with our counter-messaging campaigns spike after attacks. This happened after the attacks in Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, El Paso, and after the January the 6th insurrection. I'll end with one important finding. In our online engagement with right-wing extremist actors, we find they are disproportionately interested in consuming self-help or mental health content. We find that right-wing extremists are 48% more likely than the general public to engage with support online when offered. We find they are 115% more likely to engage with this content if they were interested in joining a violent far-right organization. We've tested this with jihadist audiences as well and found similar rates. This trend holds in nearly every geography we try it. It provides important evidence to show these audiences are receptive to interventions online when offered. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to fielding any questions.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you to everyone else for those fantastic presentations. Now, in the interest of time, we'll move right into the Q&A session. I'll start with a question that's directed to Jacob, but I think it probably applies to more than just Jacob. I think particularly Ashley could potentially speak to that as well. So the question was, how do you assess the interplay between traditional hierarchical groups like the Nordic resistance movement and the new wave groups like Atomwaffen? So Jacob, if you want to start with that, and then whoever else wants to jump in, please feel free.
Of course. So, I mean, ideologically, oftentimes these groups are aligned on very much key talking points, as you would expect when looking at the extreme right. Through my work on social media, when you look at this, you will find that they communicate with each other. The supporters communicate with each other as well. So there is that interplay of ideas. But I think what's more interesting is actually looking at the sort of increased atomization of individual radicalization through what we call the post-organizational dynamic. So I will go back to that idea of the sort of the slide there. What we were looking at was over a network of over 200 closely connected Telegram accounts associated with white supremacy. Now, what you will find in a number of these public channels, right, is there is a complete mishmash of content, some of it coming from hierarchical groups, some of it harking back to historical movements, some of it coming from these sort of new wave movements, if you want to call it that, the sort of accelerationist siege culture groups. And I think this really speaks to individual radicalization today. Through the affordabilities and the networking affordabilities of social media, people are able to sort of pick and choose and build their own ideology. I think this is really important when we look at sort of threats going forward, right? When you look at conspiracy theories and the sort of loose network of conspiracy theorist ideology, right, you will have people, as Kate was saying, coming at this from a conspiracy theory angle, starting to pick up at things from anti-Semitism, starting to pick up things from these movements. And I think that that's the dynamic we're going to continue to see, right, is a shift away from hierarchical organizations, which still will exist, and towards these individuals sort of having this pick and mix, grab bag of sort of different talking points and tropes.
And I'll just jump in very briefly. I would say it's interesting that those were the two selected exemplars, because in the data set, there's actually a whole discussion about the Nordic resistance movement and how they're total losers, according to Atomwaffen division, and an example of what not to be. So there is an interplay where different types of organizations or different identified organizations that may share some ideas and amplify messaging in certain ways online actually utilize sort of disparagement of groups as a way to build homosocial affinities within their own group, right? So what the Atomwaffen folks were doing was bonding over their dislike and disgust at Nordic resistance movement. And that may be specifically because they don't see them as violent enough, or they don't see them as using the same type of tactics they do. But the interplay works on a couple of different levels is what I see in that. So there's this broader thing we've been talking about of blended ideologies moving across borders, how amplification works across social media platforms. But then there's this also like, how do the individual groups understand their place, or how do they promote their own status within the kind of hierarchy of broader communities, and what use does that have? And in this case, Atomwaffen was using it as a way to create and bolster their sense of superiority.
Right. I will move on to the next question. Wait, sorry, just listed. So how do you foresee the impact of climate change? Will it alter or will it solidify online connections in the future? This is really directed at any one of you who has a view on that. Maybe Kate wants to start because she hasn't had a chance to speak so far. But I'll leave that up to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, but I will also let Ashley and Jacob chip in because this is a hard one. I think it's the one thing that I initially came to mind is the kind of like relating it to COVID, then the way that these extremist groups really monopolize on that sense of crisis. So I imagine I imagine a similar thing, and just this week, you know, the audiences in the UK are really subverting narratives around COP26 to direct audiences to their groups. So really like capitalizing on this kind of end of world type messaging in some of the spaces that I've been monitoring. I guess also more generally, I would call out that climate change is really complicated and crosses a lot of ideological barriers. So obviously there's a big eco-fascist movement, but often, yeah, there can often be criticisms of kind of environmental warfare directed across the political landscape. And yeah, so I think really interesting on the kind of end of world type narratives, but also we need to be careful about how we interpret that as kind of a single issue and ascribing it to a particular political ideology.
Ashley, Jacob, any thoughts on that, or should we move on to the next question? Right. I'll actually combine two questions here, but one of them, somebody was asking, does further regulation of social media companies offer a solution to the spread of this content online? There's a lot of attention on Facebook recently and their amplification of various content. And I would also link this to another question on successful intervention campaigns. I know Kate already mentioned some of Moonshot's work on that, but maybe somebody else wants to also add some of their work. I know ISD are also obviously involved in intervention work. So I'll leave it up to you who wants to start with this one. I don't know if Ashley wants to start or somebody else, but go ahead.
I mean, I can take a stab at it. Regulation works differently with these types of groups and organizations than it does with other types of terrorist and extremist content, particularly in the US, right? So there's definitely room for discussions of what does regulation need to look like, how would it work effectively. One of the problems with far-right extremist content materials is particularly with the blending we've seen, is it blends right into now conservative politics in the US. And that makes it very problematic with particularly our First Amendment to address regulation. And that also offers another narrative for these groups to utilize. So it just definitely requires some deep thought and deep discussion and analysis of how a network solution for something like that would work. So handing off.
If I could come in though, I think we have kind of unfortunately reached a stage where self-regulation and self-moderation by these platforms has proved to be completely ineffective. And I think we've reached a stage where if you want to get a hand on these issues, issues of extremism, but as I said, this sort of broader online hybridized harm where hate and conspiracy and extremism bleed into one another, then I think regulation is going to be essential. And what we know through the sort of consistent series of leaks from Facebook are sort of two things. Like, first of all, they will sacrifice internal efforts designed to make the problem better in the face of profit. We've seen this with them turning down internal efforts to moderate their recommendation algorithms, right, which they know facilitate radicalization. But also, they might reel out stats. We've taken down X million pieces of hate content this year, but actually, if you look at leaks from the Middle East and the MENA region, what you can see is that their internal systems are completely poorly designed. You have people moderating content in languages they don't speak. You have mutant algorithms which are incorrect 70% of the time. So when you look at this, yes, we have reached a stage where we need to regulate these, but that regulation should move beyond pieces of content. What we see in Germany is content-focused regulation really misses a small point. We need to have regulation which encourages transparency around big business model, but also encourages these companies to put the safety and well-being of their users central to their business models.
And just to jump off the back of that, I think there's also kind of 2 points that we're getting at, which is firstly, the kind of terrorist group ecosystem, which is like a really difficult and nuanced response is required. But then there's this also broader mainstreaming of content that we've seen that kind of these platforms have facilitated. And that's the bit where I believe like deplatforming is really effective. And particularly as Ashley and Stuart mentioned earlier, the disparity in use of these platforms compared with right-wing terrorist groups compared to Islamist terrorist groups is really stark. And it's just interesting to know that Islamist terrorist groups have been subject to much harsher moderation for 15 years now. So I do think there is something that can be done in this area, but it is really hard for the reasons outlined by the other speakers.
We also just got a clarification question in for Kate specifically. So would it be possible to elaborate more on what it means that they are more likely to click on mental health content? Do you have any concrete examples for that?
Yeah, definitely. And I'd point you to some of the resources on the Moonshot website. And hopefully we're releasing an impact report at the end of this year, which will have some of this outlined as well. But basically it's, we'll offer a range of different content and kind of do beta testing to work out which resonates best with which audience groups after kind of having gone through a lot of ethical and do no harm reviews. And yeah, we are always surprised about the popularity of mental health content. There's a really interesting analysis on Indonesian extremist audiences, which I'd point you to. And yeah, it's everything from kind of meditation and mindfulness exercises all the way through to kind of crisis hotlines and linking right-wing extremists, yeah, with individual therapists to help them.
Thank you. Now we're nearing the 1 hour mark of our session, but I'll just throw in one last question and ask you for very quick answers. And I know it's a bit unfair, but how has the recruitment and radicalization changed in the social media sphere with increased conspiracy theories in the mainstream media and politics? So if you could keep this really short, my apologies, but would just like to hear from all three of you before we end this. Whoever wants to start.
I'll keep it very quick. I think sort of the hybridization of these threats is really important. If you look at the networks, we're seeing like increasingly diffuse networks of connected channels. So I think, as we heard from Ashley, kind of QAnon channels being connected sort of in extremists to atomorphin channels, right? This is something which we see time and time again, and I think it really does complicate things. On the one hand, it produces new pathways which people may have into extremist movements, but actually it also creates, as I was saying, this sort of very atomized pick and mix approach to extremism, right? It also means you'll have people operating within networks with right-wing extremists who are actually fairly ideologically agnostic, but are motivated by one or two issue areas. So I think ultimately it complicates it, but also significantly broadens it.
Yeah, I would say in a broad discussion is the social media environment and the digital media environment have enabled a really strong capacity to shift the Overton window through this kind of blended ideological narratives, right? So mainstream news picks up discussions that are coming out of and have been coming out of for years, these fringe groups, for a variety of reasons. And so as Kate mentioned when she was talking about QAnon, the Save Our Children, Save the Children movement was, protest mobilization all over the world. It wasn't just in the UK. We had them all over the US as well. And that ran wildfire through online moms communities in those hashtags and spread really broadly beyond what we think of as typical platforms through the use of social media and through influencers that are connected dots between these normal communities and extreme communities. So it does have an effect, in particular, for shifting conversations that move into the mainstream in new ways.
Yeah, and I'd just build on everything that has already been said and just echo the kind of mental gymnastics and multiple routes of entrance that are currently provided by the current system. So there are just so many more ways into really extreme thought than there used to be. And yeah, that makes for a really difficult moderation space. Thanks.
Thank you so much for keeping that very brief and for your very insightful views on all of that. With that, I will just give a big thank you to all of our fantastic speakers and also to everyone who's tuned in. And I will hand right over to Jessica, who will be chairing the next session, which will go deeper into the physical and ideological connections of the global far right. Thank you very much.